From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Kristen Amiot. It's Wednesday, October 15, 2025. Northern Territory Principal Gavin Morris will learn his fate on Wednesday after he was charged with physically assaulting 5 students. The former principal of Yiparinya School in Alice Springs came to prominence during the town's youth crime crisis and pleaded not guilty to allegedly choking and pulling the ears of 5 boys. That story is live right now at theaustralian.com.au. Phase 1 of a historic Middle East peace deal is all but done, with the return of 20 living hostages to Israel and the release of thousands of Palestinian prisoners. But that doesn't necessarily mean smooth sailing for the next step. Plus, as the world celebrates peace in the Middle East, the question becomes, what about Ukraine? That's today's episode. In Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt on Monday, US President Donald Trump and more than 20 world leaders gathered to witness the official signing of a historic peace deal between Israel and Hamas.
This took 3,000 years to get to this point. Can you believe it? And it's going to hold up too. It's going to hold up.
Among those in attendance was Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, French President Emmanuel Macron, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and former PM Tony Blair, who'll be involved with a proposed new peace council. They were joined by officials from Qatar, Egypt and Turkey who led negotiations. What, if anything, should we make of the mix of leaders in the room for the signing of the peace agreement on Monday?
I think the most important thing was the number of leaders of Arab nations that were there.
Cameron Stewart is the Australian's chief international correspondent.
And that really is one of the key things that has put enormous pressure on Hamas, because they just realise they've lost the backing of the mainstream Arab world. And that's a massive thing. So they've got no one to turn to, they've got no benefactors. And there's been a huge achievement, I think, by Donald Trump and the United States to actually get to this point where the Arabs have come round and backed his peace deal. That's just a massive moment. And I think the combination of the fact that the peace deal has thrown out some of the absurd elements on the left and the right and has got a much more mainstream, middle-of-the-road position on a whole range of issues is backed, of course, by Israel, the US, Western Europe and Arab states, really means Hamas has got nowhere to go, frankly.
Donald Trump clearly sees this as a done deal if his address to the Knesset on Monday night is anything to go by.
This is not only the end of a war. This is the end of an age of terror and death, and this is the historic dawn of a new Middle East.
But even in the midst of this historic deal, he's taken the opportunity to talk about tariffs, for example. What's the risk for the Middle East, and really for the rest of the world, if his attention is diverted to other things now that he sees this deal as being done?
Well, it's going to be a good test of Donald Trump's determination and concentration, I guess, over the longer term, because yes, you're right. This peace deal in the Middle East is deliberately staged in phases. And it's deliberately done so because you couldn't have the whole thing delivered at once. It has to be done through negotiated phases. And that requires a very present US president. It requires a US president to push each stage with the equal zest to get it through. And in fact, the stages become harder. The hostage release stage was actually one of the easier ones compared to the other ones. So you're really right. Trump has got a lot on with his tariff wars around the world, Ukraine, lots of civil unrest at home. I mean, he's a busy man. And so he's going to have to be very much on the ball with this peace deal, because the moment America gets distracted, that leaves room for mischief elsewhere with Hamas, potentially even with Israel, with Arab nations. I mean, you really need America to be there very strongly and centrally in this deal.
Is the return of 28 deceased hostages, which has yet to happen because Hamas says they're either unsure of their location or because those hostages, their bodies are in the custody of other groups in Gaza, is that a way for Donald Trump to keep pressure on Hamas to follow through on this deal, at least in the immediate future, do you think?
Yes, I think he's going to use every sort of element he can to keep the pressure on Hamas. I mean, certainly it was distressing for the families waiting for these poor deceased hostages to come home, that only 4 of them out of 28 came home on the first day. Look, I don't think it's the sort of thing that would derail the peace deal, because I think it's genuine that Hamas simply can't find a lot of these bodies, because why would they give over all the live hostages and not the ones who have passed away? So I think it's a temporary irritant rather than anything larger. I think the larger test will come, Kristen, when we get the second phase of the peace deal. We get to the pointy end of that, where they really look at Hamas, Americans, and say, okay, it's time to disarm, and we are creating an interim government here that is going to replace you as the power source in Gaza. That's going to be a progress that really will put pressure on Hamas, and that's when we'll know a lot more about exactly what sort of group Hamas is now after 2 years of war.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Is the Hamas we're seeing now the same Hamas that we've seen up to this point?
Well, certainly it's still the same despicable sort of murderous terrorist group. There's no doubt about that. They're not suddenly become nice guys here. But what we are seeing is that the Hamas of today is not the Hamas even of a few months ago. I mean, we would never have seen the sort of concessions that Hamas has given to get to this peace deal even a few months ago. They were just completely belligerent on almost every aspect of a solution then. But now we've seen them do things you never would have dreamed of. To release all of the live hostages at once is amazing, because they effectively lose their leverage against Benjamin Netanyahu's Israel. And secondly, Hamas was always insistent that if it ever released hostages, the Israelis could not have military presence in Gaza. As it turns out, Israel still controls effectively half of Gaza, yet all of the hostages are released. My point being that Hamas is a group now that has been beaten and bludgeoned down by 2 years of war. Its main commanders have been killed. Its best fighters have been killed. It hasn't really got a coherent command structure in any way at all. It's not destroyed. There's still a lot of potential militants out there, but it's not really a cohesive force. And it's certainly open to negotiation by forced hand, if you like, much more so than it ever was before. So that's why I think that Hamas could easily get to a position where it feels it will negotiate some sort of successful progress on the peace plan, simply because it is such a weakened body.
What about the next layer of this equation? Obviously, we've got Hamas being backed by Hezbollah, which is backed by Iran. What do you think is in the minds of those groups now?
I think they have just been completely comprehensively defeated by Israel. It's been just such a historic disaster for the axis of Islamic evil, if you like, in the Middle East. And what I mean by that is, of course, Hezbollah and Iran, the Houthis and Hamas. Each of those entities have had significant defeats in the 2 years since the October 7 massacre of Israelis. It is a game-changing strategic defeat for these groups. And it is ironic, even though we've had absolute catastrophic death and disaster in Gaza, the Israel of today is so much safer than it was before October 7 on every single border. That's not to say there won't be lots of problems in the future. This is the Middle East after all, but it's really been a strategic game changer the last 2 years. And certainly with Netanyahu, he's been heavily criticised for his heavy-handed policies in Gaza, but certainly on a broader strategic canvas, he's been remarkably successful in cowering Hezbollah, Iran and the Houthis. And of course, even in Gaza, despite the terrible civilian toll, Hamas is a broken force effectively.
Coming up, will Donald Trump throw his weight around in the Russia-Ukraine conflict? In the midst of last year's presidential election campaign, Donald Trump made a characteristically bombastic claim.
If I were president, and I say this, I will end that war in one day. I would get that deal done within 24 hours. That war has to be stopped. That war is a disaster.
But as Trump takes a victory lap in the Middle East, the reality in Ukraine becomes even more stark. You mentioned earlier that Donald Trump is spinning a lot of plates at the moment, one of which is the conflict that's happening between Russia and Ukraine. What does this historic success in the Middle East mean for Ukraine, Cam? Do you think Volodymyr Zelensky is watching what's unfolding with some hope that peace can be achieved in his country as well?
Well, in fact, yes, Zelensky came out and said, this is how you win deals. You be heavy on the enemy. And of course, he meant with Hamas in that situation, but of course with Ukraine, that's Russia. So really, I think Trump is buoyed by his diplomatic success in the Middle East and now having a second look at Ukraine, which will be really interesting because he's also, in the same breath, has suggested he might even provide Tomahawk long-range cruise missiles to Ukraine. Now, that would be remarkable because the Americans have never done that. So the key with Ukraine is that while Donald Trump has said the US won't supply direct weapons to Ukraine, because that was his campaign pledge when he was getting elected, he is willing to sell US weapons to European nations who can on-sell them to Ukraine. So really the truth of it is that Ukraine will still be supplied by the West in a way that we weren't certain about when Donald Trump was elected. So that's very good news for Ukraine. And that's something which is going to be very important to actually be able to keep Ukraine fighting effectively against Russia for the indefinite future. Now, that sort of rhetoric, you don't know how serious to take Trump when he says that sort of thing. But the bottom line is he's clearly thinking about a tactic which sees him and the US be a lot firmer against Vladimir Putin to try and push Putin to the negotiating table, having failed to flatter Putin to the negotiating table. That is the sort of sense that we're getting, that Trump would like to bounce off the Middle East deal and then go back into the Ukraine talks and see what he can come up with.
Cameron Stewart is the Australian's chief international correspondent. You can read all his reporting and analysis anytime at theaustralian.com.au.